The first time Elise Hartmann sang before the imperial court of Vienna, she forgot a single note, not because she was frightened, not because the hall was crowded with nobles draped in silver and velvet, but because one man in the royal balcony had been watching her too closely. Duke Adrian von Reinfeld stood apart from the others like winter itself. Cold, controlled, untouchable. While the audience applauded politely, he did not move at all. He only watched her. And when her voice faltered for one trembling second, she saw something shift behind his eyes, not mockery, concern. The moment vanished quickly, but it unsettled her for the rest of the evening. Later that night, whispers followed her through the palace corridors. The Duke noticed the singer. She should be careful. He has already promised to Lady Beatrice. Elise kept her head lowered and walked faster through the candle-lit halls. She had spent years building a respectable position within the Imperial Opera House. A woman without title survived through caution, through silence, especially near men like Adrian von Reinfeld, men powerful enough to ruin lives without raising their voices. Rain struck the palace windows as she gathered her music sheets backstage. Most performers had already gone home. Only distant laughter echoed from the ballroom above. Then she noticed the shadow near the doorway, the Duke. Elise froze immediately. He removed his gloves slowly. "You stopped breathing during the final verse." Stared at him, uncertain whether she had offended him somehow. "I apologize, Your Grace. You mistake my observation for criticism." His voice was calm, low, restrained. It somehow made her more nervous. "You sang as though the words hurt you." Elise lowered her gaze. Perhaps they did. For the first time he looked almost surprised by her honesty. A long silence settled between them. Outside, thunder rolled softly over Vienna. "You should not walk home alone in this weather," he finally said. "I always do." "You should not." Carriage ride through the rain became the beginning of everything. And later, Elise would remember it as the precise moment her life quietly divided into before him and after him. The streets shimmered beneath lantern light while rain traced silver lines down the carriage windows. Adrian sat across from her, composed and unreadable, yet his attention never fully left her, not once. "You are not frightened of me," he said eventually. "I think everyone is frightened of you, but not you." Elise looked toward the rain. "I think lonely people recognize each other." The words escaped before she could stop them. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he turned toward the window beside him, hiding something in his expression. That silence told her more than any answer could have. Over the following weeks, Vienna began speaking about them without evidence, because that was what society enjoyed most. Not truth, possibility. Adrian appeared at rehearsals he had no reason to attend. Elise would glance toward the darkened balconies and find him already watching her. Sometimes he said little, sometimes nothing at all. But his silence became strangely familiar, dangerously familiar. One winter evening after a performance at Schönbrunn Palace, Elise stepped into an empty corridor and nearly collided with Lady Beatrice von Amsel, the Duke's future bride, beautiful, elegant, calm. Beatrice smiled softly, though sadness lingered beneath it. "You sing beautifully, Miss Hartmann. You, my lady." Beatrice adjusted her gloves carefully. "You should be cautious with kind attention from powerful men." Elise felt heat rise into her face. "My lady misunderstands." "No," Beatrice interrupted gently. "I understand perfectly." The quiet pity in her eyes humiliated Elise far more than cruelty would have. That night, Elise resolved to avoid Adrian entirely. But avoidance became impossible, because he began seeking her, not publicly, never carelessly, always quietly. A conversation beside palace gardens covered in snow. A brief exchange after midnight rehearsals. A folded music composition left anonymously outside her dressing room. And slowly, painfully, Elise realized the cold Duke frightened her less than the hope beginning to grow inside her. One evening, during a grand imperial ball, she stood alone near the terrace doors while nobles danced beneath golden chandeliers. She did not belong there. Everyone knew it. The whispers around her felt sharp enough to cut skin. Then Adrian crossed the ballroom directly toward her. Every conversation softened. Every gaze followed him. He stopped before her without hesitation. "You disappeared from rehearsal." I believed it wise. Now she swallowed carefully. "I still do." For a long moment he simply looked at her, then very quietly he said, "You have no idea what you are doing to me." Her heart stumbled painfully. Before she could answer, another noble approached Adrian regarding political matters. The spell broke instantly. But as Elise turned away, she heard one woman whisper nearby. She looks at him as though she has forgotten her place. For the first time, shame entered her feelings for him. Yet later that night, when Elise returned home, she discovered a single white rose waiting outside her door. No note, no signature, only the faint scent of winter, and somehow she knew he had placed it there himself. Vienna became colder as winter deepened, so did the rumors. Elise heard them everywhere now, at rehearsals, in palace corridors, behind gloved hands during concerts. The Duke's fascination with the palace singer had become entertainment for society. Some believed she was ambitious, others pitied her foolishness. A few simply waited for the inevitable humiliation. Elise tried to distance herself from Adrian, but he noticed immediately. One evening after rehearsal, she exited through the servants' courtyard, hopping to avoid attention. Snow fell softly beneath the lanterns. She nearly reached the gate before his voice stopped her. "You are avoiding me again." She closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Adrian stood beneath the snowfall in a dark wool coat, his expression unreadable. "You should not follow me, Your Grace." "Yet I do." The quiet certainty in his voice unsettled her. "You are promised to another woman." His jaw tightened faintly. "That arrangement was decided long before I met you, but it still exists." The snow gathered lightly across his shoulders, then he stepped closer. "Do you think I sleep peacefully these days, Elise?" Her breath caught. "You should." "I do not." His honesty frightened her more than distance ever could. For weeks he had remained restrained, controlled, but now exhaustion lingered beneath his composure, as though fighting himself had become difficult. "You must stop this," she whispered. Instead of answering, he removed his gloves and reached toward her slowly, not possessively, carefully. His fingers brushed a snowflake from her hair. The gesture felt unbearably intimate. "Elise." It was the first time he had spoken her name like that, softly, as though it mattered too much. She stepped back immediately, and for the first time she saw pain cross his face, real pain. That night she cried after returning home, furious with herself for loving a man who belonged to another future. But love rarely asks permission before arriving. Spring brought brighter skis to Vienna, and more danger. During an imperial garden gathering, Elise performed before aristocrats beneath flowering trees while musicians played softly nearby. Adrian arrived late. The moment he entered the garden, her voice faltered again. His gaze found her instantly, always instantly. And unfortunately, everyone noticed. After the performance, Elise escaped toward the quieter side of the estate near the fountains. She needed air, needed distance from those staring eyes, but Adrian followed. "You should not look at me that way in public," she whispered sharply. "How do I look at you? As though I belong to you." The words stunned both of them. For a long moment neither moved. Then Adrian said quietly, "Perhaps that is the problem." Before she could respond, footsteps approached nearby. Lady Beatrice appeared beneath the marble arches. Elise immediately stepped away. But Beatrice had already seen enough. A terrible silence settled. Adrian straightened at once, his expression turning cold again, controlled, untouchable. The transformation wounded Elise more deeply than it should have. Beatrice looked between them carefully. Then she smiled with heartbreaking grace. "The Emperor is searching for you, Adrian. Your Grace, Adrian." The intimacy of it suddenly made Elise feel foolish, small, invisible. Adrian nodded once. Before leaving, he looked at Elise briefly. But he said nothing, not one word. That silence followed her for days. And then came the opera banquet. The night everything changed. The ballroom glittered with gold candlelight and crystal glasses. Nobles laughed beneath painted ceilings while musicians performed softly near the staircase. Elise entered cautiously. Almost immediately, conversations shifted around her. Too quiet, too aware. Something was wrong. Then she saw them. Adrian and Beatrice standing together before the imperial court, and on Beatrice's hand rested a sapphire engagement ring newly placed there. Applause filled the ballroom. Someone announced the formal confirmation of their marriage alliance. Elise felt her entire body go cold. She had known this would happen. Of course she had known. But knowledge did nothing against heartbreak when it finally arrived. Across the ballroom, Adrian's gaze found hers, and remained there, even while others congratulated him. Even while Beatrice stood beside him, he looked only at Elise. That somehow made the pain worse, because beneath all his restraint she saw something devastating in his expression. Regret. That night Elise left the palace alone. Rain soaked the streets of Vienna while carriage wheels splashed through darkness. She walked without direction, tears burning behind her eyes. Then suddenly another carriage stopped beside her. Adrian stepped out into the rain. Elise. She turned away immediately. Please. The word sounded unfamiliar coming from him, almost desperate. You should return to your fiancé, she whispered. He moved closer slowly. Rain drenched his coat and dark hair. You think this is simple for me, she laughed softly then, a wounded sound. Your Grace, I think it is simple for everyone except me. His face tightened painfully. I never intended to hurt you, but you did. Silence between them became unbearable. Finally, she whispered the question she had feared asking for months. Was any of it real? Adrian stepped toward her immediately. Real that it has ruined my peace completely. Her eyes filled with tears. For one reckless moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead he closed his eyes briefly and stepped back, as though restraining himself physically hurt him. You must trust me a little longer, he said quietly. She stared at him in confusion. For what? But he only looked at her with something close to anguish, and then he left her standing alone in the rain. After the engagement announcement, Vienna became merciless. Elise could feel the change everywhere. Before, society had whispered about her with amusement. Now they looked at her with ridicule. Women fell silent when she entered rooms. Noblemen exchanged knowing smiles behind crystal glasses. Even servants stared too long. The palace singer who believed a duke could love her. How embarrassing. Elise buried herself in music to survive it. She practiced until dawn, sang until her throat ached. Accepted performances outside the palace simply to avoid seeing Adrian. But avoiding him only made his absence louder. And somehow, he continued appearing anyway, always unexpectedly. One afternoon, while rehearsing alone inside the opera hall, Elise noticed someone seated in the highest balcony, still, silent, watching Adrian. The empty theater glowed softly beneath afternoon light. Dust drifted through the air like pale snow. Elise stopped singing immediately. You should not be here. His voice echoed quietly from above. And yet I am. She gathered her sheets quickly, refusing to look at him again, but before she could leave, he descended the staircase slowly. The sound of his footsteps filled the hall, measured, heavy, dangerous to her heart. When he reached the stage, he stopped several feet away as though even he no longer trusted himself near her. You have avoided every invitation. You are marrying another woman. Expression darkened faintly. You repeat that as though I have forgot. Could I let myself forget? For a moment, anger flashed behind his restraint, not at her, at himself. You think I do not understand what this has cost you? Nah, Allah said softly. I think you understand perfectly. His words landed harder than accusation because they were true. Adrian looked away briefly, jaw tense, then his gaze returned to her. There are circumstances you do not know. Then tell me. Sullensa, again always silence. Allah's felt exhaustion wash through her. I cannot survive loving someone who speaks in unfinished sentences. Pun flickered across his face, small, quick, but real. You once told me lonely people recognize each other, he said quietly. Do not pretend you no longer recognize me. Her chest tightened painfully, because despite everything she still did. That was the tragedy. Weeks later, the imperial court hosted a spring masquerade. Allah's almost refused to attend, but performers were required. The ballroom shimmered beneath hundreds of candles. Music floated through the palace while masked nobles danced beneath painted ceilings. Allah's sang from the orchestra gallery above the crowd. And despite every effort not to, she searched for Adrian constantly. She finally spotted him near the grand staircase, beside Beatrice. His future wife wore silver silk and diamonds in her hair. Beautiful, composed, untouchable. The sight hollowed something inside Allah's. Then another nobleman approached her during intermission. Lord Muthalas Udavan, young, charming, kind-eyed. Unlike most aristocrats, he spoke to her naturally, without condescension, without hidden amusement. You sing as though you break your own heart each evening, he said gently. Allah smiled faintly. Perhaps that is why audiences enjoy it. Muthalas laughed softly. And for the first time in months, Allah's found herself relaxing around someone. They spoke beside the terrace doors while music drifted through the ballroom. She did not notice Adrian watching until much later, but when she finally did, the expression in his eyes unsettled her deeply, jealousy, pure and unmistakable. For the rest of the evening, Adrian barely spoke to anyone. Beatrice noticed. So did everyone else. At one point, Matthias offered Ullaz his arm for the next dance. She hesitated, not because she lacked permission, but because somewhere across that ballroom stood a man capable of destroying her composure with a single glance. And unfortunately, Adrian was already looking at her, coldly, intensely, almost angrily. Ullaz accepted Matthias's arm anyway. The dance felt strangely freeing at first, until halfway through when she glanced toward Adrian again. He had left the ballroom entirely. Something about his absence suddenly ruined the music. Later that evening, Ullaz stepped onto the palace terrace for air. Night rain had begun falling lightly over Vienna. She wrapped her shawl tuta around herself. Then she heard the terrace doors open behind her. Adrian, of course. You seemed happy with Lord Matthias. His tone remained calm, too calm. Ullaz stared toward the rain-soaked gardens below. Am I forbidden from Hupanas? You know that is not what I meant. Then what did you mun? He stepped closer, close enough that she could hear the restraint in his breathing. You should be careful with men who become attached too quickly. A sharp laugh escaped her. Udachu, for the first time, real emotion cracked through his control. You think I enjoyed watching him touch you? His confession stunned the air between them. Ullaz turned toward him slowly. Rain drifted onto the terrace stones behind him. And what right do you have to jealous her? His expression shifted instantly, because she was right, completely right. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Adrian said quietly, none. That single word hurt more than anger would have, because it sounded honest, tired, defeated. Ullaz looked away before her tears could betray her. You should go back inside, your grace. Instead, he stepped even closer, so close she could feel warmth through the cold night air. Ullaz, her pulse trembled painfully. If you continue saying my name like that, she whispered, I will forget how impossible this is. Silence afterward felt dangerous. Then suddenly the terrace doors opened again. Beatrice stood there. The moment froze instantly. Adrian stepped away at once. And once again, Ullaz watched him become distant before her eyes, controlled, proper. The transformation wounded her more deeply this time. Beatrice looked between them quietly. Then her gaze settled on Ullaz with something almost like sympathy. This carriage is ready, Adrian. He nodded once. But before leaving, he looked back at Ullaz. And in that brief moment, she saw something terrifying in his expression. Not passing affection, not temptation, love, real love. The kind, powerful men feared most. And for the first time, Ullaz understood this story would not end without destroying one of them first. Summer arrived over Vienna in heavy golden light, and with it came cruelty disguised as elegance. The imperial court hosted endless gatherings before the duke's approaching wedding. Every ballroom glittered brighter than the last. Every noblewoman spoke of Lady Beatrice's fortunate future, and every whisper surrounding Ullaz became sharper. Some claimed she had invented the duke's affection entirely. Others insisted she had tried to trap him before failing publicly. The worst part was Adrian's silence. He neither defended her nor denied the rumors. He simply endured them, as though suffering quietly had become his preferred punishment. One evening, Ullaz performed at a private concert inside the Runfold estate itself. She had attempted to refuse. The request had not allowed it. The mansion stood overlooking the Danube beneath fatting sunset, magnificent and cold. Candles illuminated endless corridors while servants guided guests through marble halls. Ullaz felt unwelcome before she even entered, especially when she saw Adrian waiting near the staircase. His gaze lingered on her for one unbearable second. Then guests approached him and the moment disappeared. Throughout the evening, Ullaz could feel him watching her, not openly, never openly, but constantly. Every song she sang felt directed toward the man refusing to approach her, and every silence between verses felt heavier than the music itself. After the performance, Ullaz escaped into the garden alone. Night air cooled the heat gathering painfully in her chest. She stood beside the fountain beneath pale moonlight trying to steady herself. Then Adrian appeared behind her. You should not wander here alone. She laughed softly without turning around. You always say that. Because it remains true. The fountain water shimmered quietly between them. Elise finally faced him. "You invited half of Vienna tonight. My mother arranged the gathering. But you allowed it." A shadow crossed his face. Yes, honesty surprised her. For months he had hidden behind restraint and unfinished explanations. But tonight exhaustion seemed to weigh heavily on him. "You look tired," she said before thinking. His eyes softened faintly. "I have not slept well in a very long time." Neither had she. The admission settled between them quietly. Then Adrian reached into his coat and removed folded sheet music. Elise recognized it instantly. The composition he had anonymously left outside her door months earlier. "You wrote this," she whispered. He nodded once. Her chest tightened painfully. "You never told me. Are many things I never told you." Sadness in his voice frightened her. She unfolded the pages carefully. At the top, written in dark ink, were only 4 words: "For the woman forgotten nowhere." Elise's vision blurred immediately. Adrian. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud. The effect on him was immediate. His composure nearly broke. He stepped closer slowly, eyes fixed entirely on her. And for one reckless moment the distance between them vanished. No duke, no singer. Only 2 lonely people standing beneath moonlight trying not to love each other too much. Then voices echoed from the garden entrance, nobles approaching. Adrian stepped back instantly. Again. Always again. Elise suddenly realized she hated his restraint, hated how quickly he abandoned tenderness whenever the world appeared. The approaching guests noticed them immediately. Conversation slowed. Eyes lingered. A woman smiled knowingly behind her fan, and Elise felt humiliation rise through her like fire. Without another word, she handed the music back to Adrian. His expression tightened. "Elise, you should return to your guests, Your Grace." She walked away before he could stop her, but the damage had already spread. The next morning, Vienna awoke to new gossip. The Duke chasing the palace singer through moonlit gardens. Lady Beatrice abandoned during her own celebration. By afternoon, Elise heard laughter backstage at the opera house, not cruel enough to confront her directly, just loud enough for her to hear. That evening, she returned home emotionally exhausted, and discovered Beatrice waiting outside her apartment. The sight alone filled Elise with dread. Beatrice stood beneath the fatting evening sky in a pale blue dress, gloved hands folded neatly before her, graceful as always. "I apologize for arriving uninvited," she said softly. Elise unlocked the door with trembling fingers. "Please come inside." Apartment suddenly felt embarrassingly small beside noble elegance. Beatrice noticed none of it. She removed her gloves slowly and looked around the quiet room. "You love him," she said gently. There was no accusation in her voice. That somehow made it worse. Elise stared at the floor. The truth left her too tired to deny it anymore. For several seconds only silence remained, then Beatrice smiled sadly. "Does he?" Elise looked up immediately. "No, he has never once looked at me the way he looks at you." Pain flickered briefly across Beatrice's composed expression before she hid it again. Elise's throat tightened. "Then why marry him?" Beatrice turned toward the window. "Because some families survive through alliances, not affection." She paused quietly. "And because your Duke believes sacrificing himself makes him honorable." "Your Duke," the words echoed painfully. "Elise," Beatrice continued softly, "there is something terribly wrong around him lately." Fear touched Elise immediately. "What do you mean?" "He dismisses guards without explanation. Receives letters he burns unread. He barely sleeps." Beatrice hesitated. "And he watches the entrances of every room as though expecting danger." A chill moved through Elise. Before she could ask more, Beatrice stepped toward the door. "He will never tell you the truth willingly," she whispered. "Men like Adrian prefer suffering silently, even when silence destroys everyone around them." Then she left. And for the rest of the night, Elise could not stop thinking about fear hidden behind Adrian's eyes. 3 weeks later, the Duke married Lady Beatrice in the Imperial Cathedral. Vienna celebrated magnificently. Bells rang across the city, carriages crowded the streets. Nobles filled the cathedral beneath oceans of candlelight. Elise sang during the ceremony because refusing would have caused scandal. Every note felt like breaking glass inside her chest. And when Adrian finally turned toward his bride to complete the vows, his eyes found Elise instead. Just for 1 second, one devastating second, she saw misery there, raw, unhidden. Then the ceremony ended. Applause filled the cathedral. and Elise realized she had just watched the man she loved choose another life. That night society celebrated until dawn, but Elise quietly packed her belongings alone, because by morning she intended to leave Vienna forever. Elise disappeared from Vienna before sunrise. No farewell performance, no announcement, only an empty apartment and silence. By afternoon, the Palace Opera House buzzed with confusion. Some believed she had run away in disgrace. Others claimed a wealthy foreign patron had taken her abroad. Adrian said nothing. But when he learned she had left the city, witnesses later spoke of the terrifying stillness that settled over him, as though something inside him had quietly stopped breathing. Elise traveled first to Salzburg, then Milan, then Paris. Years passed slowly through music and distance, and gradually the girl Vienna once mocked disappeared. In her place rose Madame Elise Hartmann, Europe's most haunting soprano. Audiences crossed borders to hear her sing. Kings requested private performances. Composers dedicated operas to her voice. But over time, people noticed something unusual. Elise no longer performed love songs. Not once. She sang grief beautifully, longing beautifully, loneliness beautifully, but never love. When interviewers asked why, she only smiled politely and changed the subject. The truth remained buried beneath years of silence, because every love song reminded her of him. Meanwhile, Vienna changed too. Lady Beatrice died 3 years into the marriage after a winter illness swept through the capital. The empire mourned her sincerely, and Adrian withdrew almost completely from society afterward. Rumors painted him as colder than ever, more severe, more distant. But those closest to the Duke noticed stranger things. He attended operas alone, collected foreign newspapers mentioning Elise's performances, and once, during a private gathering, he became furious when a nobleman casually referred to Elise as his former mistress. She was never anyone's mistress, Adrian said with such restrained violence that the room fell silent instantly. Yet he still never contacted her, not once, until 7 years later. Elise returned to Vienna during autumn. The city greeted her like royalty now. The same society that once humiliated her suddenly praised her elegance, her talent, her international fame. Nothing disgusted her more. Carriages crowded outside the opera house opening night. Crowds gathered beneath golden lights hopping for a glimpse of the legendary singer who had conquered Europe. Elise stepped from her carriage calmly, graceful, composed, untouchable. The years had changed her beautifully, not softer, stronger. Inside the opera hall, applause thundered before she even began singing. Then the curtains opened, and across the crowded royal balcony she saw him. Adrian, older now, sharper somehow. Grief had carved quiet shadows beneath his eyes. Silver touched the edges of his dark hair, but his gaze remained exactly the same, still capable of unraveling her heartbeat instantly. The moment he saw her, the entire world seemed to disappear around him. Elise felt it physically, that unbearable recognition. 7 years vanished in one glance, yet she continued performing without faltering once. Because she was no longer the girl who forgot notes under his attention, she had learned survival. After the performance, nobles flooded backstage offering praise and invitations. Elise endured politely. Then the room gradually fell silent. She turned. Adrian stood near the doorway. No title announcement followed him. None was necessary. Every person there immediately sensed tension thickening the air itself. Elise dismissed the others calmly. Soon only the two of them remained. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Adrian said quietly, "You stopped singing love songs." The observation struck too close. Elise removed her gloves slowly to steady herself. "People change. You loved them once." The ache in his voice startled her. She met his gaze carefully. "I loved many foolish things once." The words landed exactly as intended. Adrian absorbed the wound silently. Then he stepped closer. Elise. Hearing her name in his voice again after 7 years nearly destroyed her composure, but she refused to show it. "You should not be here, Your Grace. I searched half of Europe for you." Her breath caught despite herself, but then anger surfaced immediately afterward. "And yet you never wrote." Pain flickered across his expression. "I could not." "You mean you would not?" "No." His voice lowered. "I mean could not." Tension between them tightened painfully. For years Elise had imagined this reunion countless times. In some versions she forgave him, in others she hated him. but standing before him now only exhausted her heart. "You abandoned me," she whispered. His face changed immediately, not defensiveness, not denial, pure guilt. Honesty almost made it worse. Elise looked away quickly before emotion betrayed her. Outside, distant carriage wheels echoed through rainy Vienna streets. "You married her," Elise continued softly, "and let society destroy me alone." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. "I know. You said nothing while they laughed at me." "I know." Something inside her cracked then, not loudly, quietly, the kind of pain built carefully over years. "I waited for you," she admitted before she could stop herself. "For months after leaving Vienna, I still waited." Adrian looked shattered by the confession, his voice roughened slightly. "Elise, but eventually," she continued calmly, "I realized waiting for you was destroying what remained of me." Silence, heavy, breathing became difficult inside it. Then Adrian asked the question that truly frightened him. "Do you still love me?" Elise looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in years, she answered honestly without protecting either of them. "I do not know any more." Devastation that crossed his face was immediate, because somewhere along the years, the untouchable Duke of Reinfeld had become emotionally dependent on the woman he once abandoned, and he was only beginning to understand how much. Rain followed Vienna for days after Elise's return. Cold autumn rain that blurred carriage lanterns and turned palace windows pale with mist. The city became obsessed with them again almost immediately. The widowed Duke, the famous singer, the unfinished love story society had once mocked. Only now the power between them had changed. Elise no longer needed anyone's approval, especially not Adrian's. Invitations flooded her residence daily. Nobles competed for her presence at concerts and dinners. Men admired her openly now that fame had transformed humiliation into elegance, and Adrian watched all of it in silence. One evening, Elise attended a private musical gathering hosted by Countess Winter. The ballroom glowed warmly against the storm outside. Musicians played softly while aristocrats gathered around candle-lit tables. Elise arrived wearing deep emerald silk. Conversation throughout the room slowed instantly, but not because of her beauty, because Adrian was already there. He stood near the fireplace speaking with diplomats, though his attention shifted toward her the moment she entered, always instantly. Elise greeted others calmly without approaching him, and for the first time she allowed herself not to care whether his eyes followed her afterward. The realization unsettled her more than expected. Later that evening, Lord Matthias Edivane appeared beside her again, older now, wiser perhaps, but still kind. "I was beginning to think Europe had stolen you forever," he said warmly. Elise smiled softly. "Europe returned me in one piece. That is already generous." Matthias laughed, and once again conversation with him felt easy. Safe across the room, Adrian watched them quietly, too quietly. Elise noticed his untouched drink, his rigid posture, the dangerous stillness settling around him. Jealousy transformed him into something almost frightening. Eventually Matthias offered Elise his arm toward the ballroom floor. "May I?" This time she accepted without hesitation. Music swelled gently through the hall. As they danced, Elise finally glanced toward Adrian. Mistake. His gaze held hers across the crowded room with such raw intensity that her heartbeat stumbled. There was no restraint left in it anymore, only loss and fear. When the dance ended, Adrian disappeared from the ballroom entirely. Elise hated herself for immediately searching for him afterward. She found him outside on the covered terrace overlooking rain-dark gardens. He stood alone beneath dim lantern light, shoulders tense. "Elise should not follow me," he said quietly without turning around. "You disappeared rather dramatically." A bitter smile touched his mouth. "I suddenly found breathing difficult." Honesty startled her. Rain whispered beyond the terrace roof. For a while neither spoke. Then Adrian finally faced her, and Elise realized with sudden shock how exhausted he looked, not physically, emotionally, like a man surviving years without peace. "You are cruel without intending to be," he said softly. Her brows tightened. "I danced with someone." You smiled at him. Vulnerability beneath the statement nearly broke her heart, because this powerful, feared man sounded almost wounded. "Elise," he continued quietly, "there were years I survived only by hearing your name mentioned somewhere in Europe." Her chest tightened painfully. "You do not get to say things like that now. I know, then stop. But they remained true. The rain intensified around them. Adrian stepped closer slowly. I tried to stay away from you. She looked up sharply. Why? Something shifted in his expression then. Dark, painful, haunted, for your safety. The words froze the air completely. Elise stared at him. What does that mean? Adrian's jaw tightened. And suddenly she remembered Beatrice's warning years ago, the burned letters, the fear, the guards, the sleeplessness. Her pulse quickened. What happened, Adrian? For several seconds he said nothing. Then finally, someone threatened your life. The world seemed to tilt beneath her. When? Before my marriage. Elise felt cold despite the warmth of the terrace lanterns. You are lying. I wish I were. Looked away briefly, struggling with the memory itself. There were political enemies attached to the alliance with Beatrice's family. They believed my attachment to you endangered negotiations. His voice lowered painfully. I received letters promising your death if I continued seeing you. Elise could barely breathe. You never told me. I could not risk involving you. So instead you abandoned me publicly. His silence answered everything. Pain crashed through her so suddenly she nearly stepped backward. Those years, she whispered. Adrian looked at her with unbearable regret. I thought if you hated me you would survive. Burned her eyes instantly. Did you survive? The question destroyed something inside him, because the answer was written all over his face already. No, not even slightly. Rain echoed heavily around them. Then Elise asked quietly, trembling despite herself, why did you only choose my safety after teaching me how to love you first? Adrian closed his eyes like a man physically struck. For several seconds he could not speak at all, and when he finally did, his voice sounded broken for the very first time. Because I was a coward who realized too late that loving you had already become the most dangerous truth in my life. Elise could not sleep after the terrace confession. Rain continued through the night, tapping softly against her windows while Vienna disappeared beneath fog and darkness. She stood alone beside the fireplace wearing a wool robe, replaying every memory differently now. His distance, his coldness, the sudden marriage, the silence, all of it twisted into something far more painful than betrayal, sacrifice, and somehow that hurt even more, because part of her had survived all these years through anger. Anger had kept her standing on lonely stages in foreign cities. It had carried her through humiliation and heartbreak and endless nights wondering why she had not been enough. But now she knew he had loved her desperately enough to lose her on purpose. And she did not know what to do with that truth. The next morning, Vienna awoke to fresh gossip. The Duke had spent nearly an hour alone with Madame Hartmann on the terrace during Countess Winter's gathering. Society delighted in unfinished romances. Elise ignored the whispers, but Adrian did not. By afternoon, 3 noblemen who had made insulting remarks regarding Elise publicly apologized. No one knew precisely why. Everyone guessed. That evening, Adrian arrived unexpectedly at Elise's residence. The servants nearly panicked at the sight of the Duke of Reinfeld standing beneath the doorway in heavy winter rain. Elise hesitated before allowing him inside. He removed his gloves slowly, eyes fixed entirely on her. I should not have come. Yet you did. A faint sadness touched his expression. You always remember my worst habits. The familiarity of their conversation ached beautifully. Elise motioned toward the sitting room fire. Adrian remained standing instead, as though sitting would make this too personal. Too dangerous. You deserved the truth years ago, he said quietly. Yes, I rehearsed telling you 1,000 times, and still never did. His gaze lowered briefly. There were nights I stood outside your apartment and left before sunrise because I knew if I saw you again I would ruin everything. The confession settled heavily between them. Elise folded her arms tightly. You made choices for me without asking what I wanted. I know. You decided my future alone. I know. The terrible part was that he never defended himself anymore. Every accusation simply wounded him silently because he already carried them himself. Elise walked toward the window, struggling to steady her emotions. You should have trusted me. Behind her, Adrian answered softly. I trusted my enemies less. Filled the room afterward, then she turned back toward him. Beatrice? Pain crossed his face immediately. She knew enough to understand why I married her. He paused quietly. I never lied to her about loving someone else. Elise closed her eyes briefly. That somehow made Beatrice's kindness years ago even sadder. She deserved better than both of us, Elise whispered. Yes. Fire crackled softly nearby. Adrian finally sat down, exhaustion visible in every movement now. Years ago, he had seemed untouchable to her. Now he simply looked tired, human, lonely. Elise, he said carefully, I'm not asking forgiveness tonight. Then why are you here? His answer came immediately. Because 7 years without you felt like surviving winter without ever reaching spring. The ache in his voice nearly unraveled her completely. She looked away before he could see it. Outside, snow had begun replacing the rain, winter arriving quietly over Vienna once again. You frightened me, she admitted softly, Adrian's expression tightened. When? All those years ago. Her voice trembled faintly. Not because you were cruel, because you made me feel too much. For the first time that evening, tenderness softened his entire face. You frightened me too. Honesty between them had become almost unbearable now. No games remained, no pride. Only two exhausted people standing among the ruins of a love neither had escaped. A week later, Elise performed before the imperial court once more. The grand opera hall overflowed with nobles, diplomats, and royalty. And for the first time in 7 years, the final composition on the program was a love song. The announcement alone spread whispers through the audience instantly. Backstage, Elise stood alone beneath dim candlelight trying to steady her breathing. Then she noticed Adrian waiting quietly near the curtains. He looked almost uncertain, a shocking sight in itself. I heard the program changed, he said softly. Yes, for me. Elise met his gaze carefully. For myself. Answer wounded him slightly. But she needed him to understand something important. Her healing no longer belonged entirely to him. Adrian nodded once. Then, after a hesitation that seemed painfully unfamiliar to such a powerful man, he spoke again. If you ask me to leave Vienna forever after tonight, his voice roughened faintly. I will. The statement stunned her, because she realized he truly meant it. He loved her enough now to disappear if she wished. Years ago he had made choices without her permission. Now he placed everything in her hands, including himself. Elise stepped closer slowly. Much regret lives inside you, she whispered. His eyes never left hers. You are the source of almost all of it. Emotion tightened painfully in her chest. The orchestra began preparing beyond the curtains. Time was running short. Adrian looked at her like a man trying to memorize something precious before losing it again. Elise, she waited quietly. Then he finally said the words he should have spoken years ago. I loved you from the very beginning. Breath caught sharply. The first night in the carriage, he continued softly. When you said lonely people recognize each other, I think part of me belonged to you from that moment onward. Filled her eyes instantly. Because despite everything, despite all the pain some part of her had always known, the stage manager called her name from beyond the curtains. Elise wiped her tears carefully. Then she looked at Adrian one last time before stepping toward the stage lights. You should stay for the final song, she whispered. And for the first time in years, hope entered his expression. The opera hall fell completely silent when Elise walked onto the stage. Hundreds of candle flames shimmered across gold balconies. Nobles leaned forward in anticipation. Even the orchestra seemed to breathe more softly. And high above them all, Adrian watched her with the stillness of a man whose entire future rested in the next few minutes. Elise stood beneath the warm stage lights and looked out across Vienna, the city that had once humiliated her, the city she had conquered anyway. For years she had believed returning here would reopen every wound inside her. Instead, she realized something unexpected. She was no longer standing here broken, she had survived. The orchestra began softly. A slow melody filled the grand hall like winter thawing into spring. Then Elise sang, not about tragedy, not about longing from afar, not about grief hidden behind pride. For the first time in years, she sang about love that endured despite ruin. Love that arrived imperfectly. Too late sometimes. Wounded and frightened and human, but real. Her voice trembled only once during the final verse. Because across the opera hall, Adrian's eyes had filled with tears. No one in Vienna had ever seen the Duke of Rheinfeld cry before, not when he buried his wife, not during war councils, not through years of political pressure and loss. Yet now he sat motionless in the royal balcony while one woman's voice quietly destroyed the last of his restraint. When the song ended, silence swept through the hall. 1 heartbeat. 2, then applause erupted like thunder. People rose to their feet immediately. The entire audience stood. But Elise looked only toward him. Adrian did not applaud right away. He simply stared at her with raw, helpless love written openly across his face. And somehow that meant more. Later that night, snow drifted softly across Vienna streets while carriages departed from the opera house. Elise remained backstage after the crowds disappeared. She stood alone removing jewelry before a mirror when someone knocked gently at the dressing room door. She already knew who it was. "Come in." Adrian entered quietly. For a moment neither spoke. The room glowed softly with candlelight. Snow tapped lightly against the windows, and suddenly they were no longer famous names or whispered scandals, only Adrian and Elise again, just two tired hearts standing before each other after years of separation. "You sang love songs again," he said softly. Elise met his gaze in the mirror. "Yes." "Why?" She turned toward him slowly. "Because I no longer hate myself for loving you." The words shattered whatever remained of his composure. Adrian crossed the room toward her carefully, almost like a man approaching something sacred. "Elise?" Emotion thickened his voice too heavily for further words. She could see it now. The fear inside him, not fear of society, not fear of scandal, fear of losing her again. For years she had imagined this moment differently. She thought perhaps she would demand apologies or make him suffer longer. But looking at him now only made one truth painfully clear. He had already suffered enough for both of them. "You asked once if I still loved you," she said quietly. Adrian went completely still. Elise stepped closer until only inches remained between them. "I tried very hard not to." His breathing faltered. "Some loves do not disappear," she whispered. "They simply become quieter while waiting to be seen again." Adrian looked at her as though the world itself had just been returned to him. Then very slowly, almost reverently, he lifted one trembling hand toward her face, not demanding, asking. Elise leaned into his touch before fear could stop her. The smallest breath escaped him, relief, wonder, pain finally ending. "I do not deserve another chance," he admitted softly. "Probably not." A weak laugh broke from him unexpectedly. The sound warmed the entire room. It was the first genuine laugh she had ever heard from him. "Yet," Elise continued, tears gathering in her eyes, "I am tired of pretending my heart belongs anywhere else." For several seconds Adrian simply closed his eyes, like a man overwhelmed by surviving something impossible. When he opened them again, every wall around him was finally gone. No cold duke, no restraint, only love. "I thought protecting you meant leaving you," he whispered. "But losing you was the greatest failure of my life." Elise touched his face gently. "You came back." "Yes." "You told me the truth." "Yes." "And you waited." A fragile smile touched his mouth. "I would have waited until my final breath." Emotion overwhelmed her then. Not dramatic, not explosive, quiet, deep. The kind that settles into bones forever. Adrian rested his forehead carefully against hers. Snow continued falling beyond the windows while candlelight flickered softly around them. Vienna carried on outside. Carriages moved through icy streets. Nobles whispered new stories. The world remained complicated. But inside that small room, none of it mattered anymore. Because after years of loneliness, regret, silence, and longing, they had finally stopped running from each other. And for the first time since that rainy carriage ride long ago, Elise no longer felt alone. Months later, Vienna gathered once more beneath golden chandeliers for the Imperial Winter Concert. But this time, the whispers surrounding Elise sounded different, not cruel, not mocking, soft, admiring. Because the Duke of Reinfeld no longer hid his devotion. He arrived beside her openly, stayed beside her openly, looked at her openly. As though loving her had finally become something sacred instead of shameful. During the final performance of the evening, Elise stepped onto the stage while Adrian watched from the front row. Their eyes met instantly, always instantly. And this time when she began singing the love song that once broke her heart, she smiled. Because now the man who inspired it no longer belonged to silence. He belonged to her. And when the final note faded into the candlelit hall, Adrian rose first to applaud, not as a duke, not as a powerful aristocrat, but simply as a man hopelessly, completely in love with the woman who had once taught him that lonely people recognize each other from the very beginning.